Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the Sunday of the Passion, Passion Sunday, Palm Sunday, whatever you want to call it, for this week before the coming of Easter, for the week of April 13th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get in this week's podcast, and I am excited, even though there is multiple titles for this Sunday, there's a lot of stuff to be covering, but it's a very important Sunday as we are moving into Holy Week after this Sunday. So it's an important week. It's a passionate week. And I think there is a lot to reflect on, and there's a lot of good things that we can be contemplating and thinking about. But before we jump into that, we need to look back to last week's question, which was, how do you see the past, present, and future working together in your life? And we got some good responses this week. One of them talking about how life definitely isn't linear, and how throughout this person's life, as the world has continued to seeming to be moving faster and faster, this has meant that things have had to be more flexible, but yet the reassurance that our God stays the same all the way through it. And I think that's a good analogy for life. When we look at it specifically like trees, and especially with growing up here in the Midwest where there's a lot of trees, you can see where trees have to make adjustments, where things happen and you may or may not be able to see what it was, but they made adjustments. They were able to work around it. And I think in the way in our world is moving, and the way that we should be thinking about and contemplating the world in general, we need to be able to adjust to those changes that come. And I think sometimes it's a lot easier than other times for us to be able to do that. I definitely know within my life, there's definitely been times, and my wife would verify this, where I at times get a bit stubborn. And with being stubborn, it sometimes prevents me from being able to do the things that God's calling me to do. And I think in a lot of people's lives, sometimes we can be stubborn, be that stick in the mud that prevents us from being able to move the way that God's wanting us to move, and thus limiting ourselves from actually being able to be that growth that God is calling us into. But there's a lot of texts and a lot of things that we got to be jumping into. So let's just jump into it. And we're going to start with the Liturgy of the Palms, because that's usually how these services start. And there's two different readings that go with this. So we have Psalm 118, verses 1 and 2, and 19 through 29. This is, as you would expect, is a huge praise psalm, recognizing the enduring love that God has for us, recognizing how God continues to create a way for us and our salvation. And look, this stone that the builders has rejected has become the chief cornerstone, the one that holds everything together, that everything is built upon. Recognizing that this is this amazing, rejoiceful thing. This is something that we should be lifting up and acknowledging how amazing this is, the steadfast love of what God has done. And so that then leads into the gospel text for that section, for the Palms, is from Luke chapter 19, verses 28 to 40. So this is now, Jesus has been walking and heading toward Jerusalem, and he is now at Bethany and Bethsaida, near the Mount of Olives, with his disciples. He tells them to go ahead. There will be a colt there that has never been ridden. And when they're untying it, just state that the Lord needs it. They get that question. That's what happens. They lay their cloaks on the donkey. Jesus then rides into the city. To the chagrin of the Pharisees, they're not exactly real pleased about this, and people are rejoicing and are excited, and they're spreading their cloaks on the ground, and they're kind of murmuring and calming this down, especially as the people are stating, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." And the Pharisees finally have enough and just say, "Stop this." And Jesus responds with, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." This building here in Luke's gospel, as we are moving toward the end of it, as we are getting to the apex, that we get this moment of the stones crying out. Let's get into the Liturgy of the Passion. The Old Testament text then is out of Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 to 9a. This is recognizing how when we are going through times of being weary, going through the wreckage of life, going through suffering, that God is the one who gives us the strength to continue moving forward, that we continue to lend our ear to the Lord. And in doing that, when we are getting struck and getting pulled on the beard, struck on the cheeks, pulled on the beard, that this is recognizing that God is the one who is giving us the strength to be able to see it through, even as people are vindicating me. Yet there's still moments where our faith is, where is God? Because it feels distant, but we know that the only one who can declare us guilty is God, not humankind. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 31, verses 9 to 16. This is, again, in distress. As life is getting hard, we recognize and realize that it's God who we trust. As things are difficult, as things are hard, as there are adversaries, as your neighbors are causing crazy things going on around you, this is when we continue to plea and cry out to God and recognize that it's God is the one who delivers us from the hardships of life, and recognizing that the steadfast love that God has for us will guide us through. The New Testament text or epistle text this week is out of Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. And this is then this recognition in Philippians on how Christ was God in human form, and in doing that emptied himself for our sake, took the form of a slave, and was humbled on a cross. Therefore, this is why we remember and acknowledge and confess to this being God, recognizing the sacrifice of what has taken place. The gospel text then is out of Luke, starting in chapter 22, verse 14 to chapter 23, verse 56. Alternatively, there's a shorter version that you can do, which is Luke chapter 23, verses 1 to 49. And we'll talk about kind of where that picks up. But where we start here, if you're doing the whole chapter 22 or most of here chapter 22, they're in the upper room and they're having their Passover dinner. And while this is happening, Jesus then acknowledges that someone is going to betray him. There's that little bit of a tussle back and forth. Peter then starts making these proud acclamations on how I will go with you to the end. He is not going to let Jesus go. Jesus just says, no, that's not what's going to happen. Peter, by the time the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And they then head out to the Mount of Olives to pray. While this is happening, Jesus is asking for this cup to be taken from him, and he starts dropping blood to the ground like sweat. And I want to just jump in quick. That is a rare medical condition called hematidrosis, where you typically, one of the main causes is where you are under severe stress, especially when you are going through where your fear of death or fear of being tormented. This is a potential side effect that people will go through. So we can see how this is weighing heavy on Jesus in this moment with this small detail here in verse 44 of chapter 22. He then wakes up his disciples as they're going through this. This is then also where he gets taken away. Judas is there. There's a striking of the ear of one of the chief priests. Jesus heals the ear, and then they are gathering him up to bring him to Pilate. Pilate doesn't really find anything that's going on, and in doing that then decides, this is a good opportunity for me to actually make amends here with Herod, and ends up sending him to Herod. Then this is kind of where we pick up here with Pilate and Herod and going back and forth here at the end of chapter 22 into 23. And this is where that other text picks up. Where are you the king of the Jews? When Herod sends him back to Pilate. And Pilate doesn't find any basis, but yet people are wanting him crucified. And they want Barabbas to be released. And there is some Old Testament stuff in the Pentateuch that's kind of predicting this type of thing. But this aspect of how they're going to have him crucified. As this is all happening, they bring him up to the place of the skull, and he then is getting mocked along the way. And as that's happening, he gets hung with two other criminals. One of them mocks him. The other says, why are you doing this? Don't mock this person. Don't you understand that this is the King of the Jews? Don't you fear God? Coming out of verse 40. And Jesus then says, he asks for Jesus to remember him as he comes into his kingdom. Verse 43, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. When this all happens, Jesus then is crucified. The curtain is torn in two, which has been predicted previously. This is also earlier on here. Peter denies Jesus 3 different times, with people recognizing him and him saying, that is not me, that is not me. And the cock crows, and he remembers the stuff that happens. And that's basically where we end here through 23, 1 through 49. The last 6, 7 verses here start talking about Joseph of Arimathea, who then gathers the body and lays him in a tomb with spices and ointments to prepare for the Sabbath day. So crazy events, a long story, familiar story, but yet there's a lot of details in there. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions. Since I'm an ordained minister, I really enjoy looking at and hearing different ways of thinking about and interpreting these texts. If you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend adding the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library to also your weekly preparation. Not only do they lay out the text beautifully week to week, but also have art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. Especially as we are moving into Holy Week, this is a great opportunity to go through the whole Holy Week devotion, and it can really help you get prepared as we are moving through this Holy Week. And what does this all mean, and how do we set the stage for this? So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that covers a wide variety of writers and topics, but going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into your weekly preaching, along with some additional ideas on how to look at things from more of an ecological lens. So if you haven't checked that out, the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication, that'll be the first link down in the show notes. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp that is June 21st through the 27th, designed for high school students. And this year, the topic is the sweet life, getting granular with sugar. As I've talked about before, this is something that I've been to before. I'd highly recommend checking this out if you're a high school student and you are interested in the worlds of faith and science and getting into the ethics a little bit of this. It's an amazingly run camp at Gus Davis Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. So if you haven't checked that out, I'll also have links to that down in the show notes, and I'd highly recommend checking that out as well. It is hard as a human being to get our head fully around sacrifice. And I would say, being in the 21st century, it's very difficult to get our heads around how Jesus enters Jerusalem at the beginning of the week, being hailed as a hero by many, to be crucified by the end of the week, within a week. The world in which we're in moves fast, but it sure doesn't seem to move that fast. And I think that's one of the things that's hard for us to get our head around. There's also the hard aspect that we have to deal with, and when we're confronted with this time of year yet again, is sacrifice. We're willing and able to do different types of sacrifices for our bodies, for exercise, the gym, or fitness, or for kids, or for family. But that's a different type of sacrifice than what we're recognizing here with Jesus. The closest that we get to this type of sacrifice is when we acknowledge and think about people who've been in the armed services, or people who quite literally die for their loved ones, but it still doesn't quite get to the same level of what we know is coming here. And yet it's also hard to recognize how Jesus is welcomed with a hero's welcome, to the point where he is mocked continually by the end of the week, to the point of death. But I did find something that I think doesn't match it perfectly, but I think gives us at least a little bit of a perspective from a bit of a human perspective that potentially can be helpful here to help us really get an understanding of this a little bit more. And I think in order for us to do that, we need to do a little bit of a history lesson on yellow fever. So yellow fever is a virus that comes from the Flaviviridae family, and it is transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And this mosquito originated in Africa and came to the United States probably around the 1600s as part of the slave trade, being in the water barrels that were being transported and were disposed of carelessly and didn't realize that there was larvae of these mosquitoes. And the difficult thing that happened with that is as these mosquitoes then bred their own population and brought this virus over to the United States, there wasn't really any immunity to it, or a lack thereof immunity. And so it made for some chaotic things to happen, especially as yellow fever kind of went through specifically port cities a lot. But one example of this was in 1793, Philadelphia had a large outbreak from the late summer into the fall, where roughly 10% of the whole population of Philadelphia died. A lot of the political figures of the United States fled the city because that was where the capital was. And it was one of the factors that kind of led to them stating that health and safety wasn't good in Philadelphia, thus moving where our capital of the United States was, out of Philadelphia. When yellow fever is severe, which there still is severe cases today, and as we probably know, there are vaccines now for it, and we'll get into that in a little bit here, but it can cause a lot of hemorrhaging, hepatitis resulting in jaundice, which then, if you get a severe case, the chances of death was about 50%. And again, as we talked about these mosquitoes when they initially came over, there really wasn't any immunity that was out there. So it made for a highly effective virus to be able to spread through a population. As this is all happening, we need to fast forward here almost a century or so, and we have a man named Carlos Juan Finlay, who is studying in Philadelphia and is looking at different diseases and kind of focuses in a little bit on yellow fever. And originally coming from Cuba and Havana, he ends up, after his studying, going back to Cuba and continuing to really focus in and emphasize looking into and studying yellow fever, to the point where in 1886, he puts forth a proposal at a medical conference stating that he thinks this disease at this point, not virus, disease at this point, is being transmitted by mosquitoes. He was humiliated at the conference as he was basically laughed out of the room and was kind of just seen as crazy. And it was very difficult for the rest of his career to really be taken seriously because of this theory. Now, this continued on, and what we find is Finlay finds about 20 years later his hypothesis was correct. And one of the big events that kind of happened in between there was in 1898, the United States got into the Spanish-American War. And so we had a lot of U.S. soldiers in these Caribbean habitats, and there was still a lot of yellow fever going on, New Orleans being one of the hotbeds for yellow fever consistently. And so the Army decided that this was of great concern, because to the point where when the Spanish-American War was going on, there were more soldiers dying from yellow fever than there were the actual conflict, which, as you can imagine, that's kind of difficult. So it led to the forming of the Yellow Fever Commission within the Army to kind of study this. And one of the initial leaders of this cohort is probably a name that, at least to United States citizens, might sound a little bit familiar, was Walter Reed, leading a commission that included James Carroll, Articus Almonte, and Jesse William Lazar. And this was an interesting group of people together, a lot of medical research that had happened, and a lot of different medical doctors who had gone through, specifically like Johns Hopkins University was one of the large ones that was being utilized by this group. Now, of the group, Lazar was the only one who had actually done any type of research with mosquitoes to that point. And so the four of them came down, they met with Finlay and heard about his hypothesis and decided that they were going to look into this and do this a little bit further. So this meant that they had to get the eggs of the mosquitoes, breed the mosquitoes, being able to then take them into people who had been diagnosed with the virus, which they didn't know was a virus at that point. We'll get to that in a moment. And infect the mosquito and then allow the mosquito to actually bite them. And this was something of a lot of controversy. There was a lot of times for many years it was seen as a mistake, but going through journals that were discovered in 1947, it was stated that no, this was something that was truly focused and designed that was going to happen. Now, I have, going through my research, it seemed like maybe all three outside of Reed was able to get bitten, but at minimum, Lazar and Carroll were bitten by mosquitoes with the yellow fever. This hypothesis then was given a little bit more solid basis as Lazar died 17 days later with yellow fever. And was even stated that leaving behind his wife and kids in his journal that he really felt that he was very close to these large breakthroughs and even had written to his wife talking about it. Carroll ends up dying 7 years later. And in that, one of the reasons for his death is complications due to yellow fever. This then was able to confirm the hypothesis that had happened from Finlay previously. Reed got a lot of the credit for this, but Reed did a very good job of acknowledging that a lot of his research was based off of the papers that Finlay had hypothesized 20 years prior. This then was a huge breakthrough because at that point we were also having the Panama Canal built, and 85% of the people who had been working on the Panama Canal had been getting yellow fever. And so thus it made it very difficult for progress to actually be made because people were dying and getting people to volunteer to be part of this project. As they realized that then it was mosquitoes, getting rid of still water and getting rid of that helped to improve conditions, bring additional workers in to be able to complete the Panama Canal. And thus, the last major outbreak in the United States of yellow fever was in 1905 because of how insecticides were able to come in. And later in the 1930s, Max Theiler was able to mix some antibodies with the affected brains of mice and realizing that there was proactive antibody reactions and thus being able to bring forth the beginnings of what vaccine is utilized today for yellow fever. And unfortunately, to this point, yellow fever is still highly dependent on making their vaccine out of eggs. And so it's a much slower process. So worldwide, there's still plenty of breakouts of yellow fever in different countries based on that there is not necessarily enough vaccines readily available. Much research is continuing to be done and looking at actual quantities of yellow fever that needs to be utilized to be able to have the antibodies to be able to resist some of these different viral bacteria. And again, this at this point was the first time, as I was stating, that we had ever noticed that one, we could get this kind of transmission back and forth. And because it was going through filters, they recognized that this then was not a bacteria, but something different. And thus we recognize now this was a virus. Why do I bring this all up on this Sunday? I look at Finlay as one who is looked at as crazy, victimized in certain ways, and stated that he doesn't know anything. And by the time that, yes, this was all discovered and coming out, it happened in 1900, Finlay lived for another 15 years, but the damage had been done. He hadn't really gotten his necessarily roses for his hypothesis, even though Reed did a lot of recognition for him. And a lot of these people, in certain regards, are forgotten to history in certain ways. But we are forever thankful for the research that they were able to do and recognize how that has been able to help us move forward. So in a way, it's reverse of what Jesus went through, and yet still the same. Jesus got the celebration on the front and the back end, with the ridicule in the middle. And here we can get at least the ridicule, and acknowledging now from this side what amazing things these people, these men actually did for us to be able to have the health that we have now and being able to recognize the effects of what can be used to be able to spread a deadly virus like this. I think a lot of times it's really easy for us to be caught up in emotions, caught up in the spirit of things. And heck, we can even see that with Finley, that people just said it was too hard to imagine, too hard to understand that he gets ridiculed. Or how about Jesse Lazar? It's easy to forget this 34-year-old man who decided to take a risk, decided to, why not test this on myself, and ends up dying for it, ends up sacrificing himself for our benefit. The death of Carol, the death of Lazar leads to our understanding of yellow fever, our understanding of being able to get more research into understanding how this stuff works, leading to vaccines, leading to where yellow fever, at least in the United States, has literally not been an issue for 120 years. That's noteworthy. That's worth recognizing. That's sacrifice. There are a few places where some of these people are recognized, but I know for myself, it's something that I've kind of stumbled across lately as I've prepared for these podcasts before, but I've never really dug into deeply. This was a mission to help save soldiers' lives, help save people's lives, help understand how things were going. And as we know where we're going here in the next week, is that not what Christ was doing for us on a much broader and bigger scale? It wasn't just a virus that Jesus was taking care of. Jesus was taking care of it all. And I think that's hard for us to get our heads around, and it should be. It's a lifelong pursuit for us to be able to fully understand what that means. So the question I have for you this week is, what does sacrifice really mean to you? What does sacrifice really mean to you? Because I know there is a lot of sacrifice of different things that I do for this podcast to make this happen every week, to make sure that I'm going and taking care of my body. But that's not the same type of sacrifice, I feel like, what Jesse Lazar and James Carroll ended up going through. What some of our military soldiers do, I don't think it's on the same level. But I would also say that the level of what Christ did for us is a whole nother level beyond that. And I think that's worth in this week really contemplating and thinking about. Because the only reason that one would do something like that is love and care for neighbor, for family. You know, it's easy for us as people who have military around us, for love of country as well. But I would argue the bigger one is to understand it's love for everyone, to put others in front of yourself, and recognizing what Christ did for us was putting not only the people who were in front of him ahead of him, the people at that time, but previously and to eternity, both ways. It's quite impressive when you think about it that way. Think when we contemplate and think about what sacrifice really means as we move into this week, I think it's important for us to remember there's lots of levels to this, and many of us will never achieve the type of sacrifice that others have done for the sake of the care of humanity, the care for someone else greater than themselves. And I think that's worth a moment of our time to reflect on and to think about. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.